In the wake of Horus's recovery on the cursed world of Davin, a new, darker course for humanity began to emerge, hidden from most, but inscribed into the very blood-stained legacy of what was to follow. Before open treason was declared, before the galaxy was sundered, entwined by war, the War Master would orchestrate one of the first acts of premeditated brutality under the veil of imperial compliance. The target was the Arultian technocracy. Located in the Erusus system, the technocracy had survived since the Dark Age of Technology as a rare remnant of mankind's golden age. The society itself had taken root within this system in a manner that bore striking similarities to the cult Mechanicus of Mars, a technocratic, theocratic, rigid yet effective system of governance. They were not hostile. In fact, they openly sought a parley with humanity and potentially to peacefully coexist with the Imperium in a manner much like the Mechanicus had. What happened next, however, offers a critical yet chilling insight into the state of Horus's very soul mere moments after being exposed to the ruinous powers. A diplomatic delegation was arranged aboard the Vengeful Spirit. There the War Master met with the technocracy's ruling authority, the Fabricator Consul. The discussion began as many before it had. Courtesies were exchanged, intentions were outlined, but then came a revelation that would alter the course of this encounter. The Fabricator Consul admitted that they had the possession of an operational standard template construct, not a fragment, but the entirety of the machining, and this technology was coveted by the Imperium and the Mechanicum alike. What followed was neither negotiation nor parley. Without pause, Horus turned his combi bolter onto the Fabricator Consul and executed him. In this single action, the thin veneer of diplomacy was cast aside, as the Consul's elite guard, known as the Brotherhood, were immediately targeted and purged. These warriors, clad in advanced power armor, eerily reminiscent of the Legionis Astartes, fought fiercely but were quickly overwhelmed. The official justification afterwards claimed that the Consul had smuggled a weapon aboard the Vengeful Spirit and were intent on assassinating the War Master. However, those familiar with the chain of events that would follow, particularly within the higher echelons of the Luna Wolves, suspected a different truth. By this point, the corruption seeded by Horus's pact with the Craven Gods began to fester throughout the entirety of the Legion. This was not a defensive move, but rather pretext. The conflict that followed was not brief nor surgical, but rather a prolonged and savage campaign that differed significantly from the norm of what Horus Lupercal would command, as the Sons of Horus waged a total war against the technocracy. They were not alone, as they would also be joined by the World Eaters, who brought the full fury of Angron's gene-forged rage to bear along with them. At the height of the campaign, the final bastion of resistance, the Iron Citadel, became a site of a bloodbath, as the Brotherhood fought with disciplined desperation, yet Angron himself would forge ahead and breach the walls with his own berserk assault companies. As a precaution against this, the defenders would trigger demolition charges that collapsed structures upon them, as thousands of tons of rubble seemingly could also not restrain the World Eater's Primarch, leading to Angron tearing himself free, as his monstrous chain axe would be used to annihilate the last of the Brotherhood in a single, furious, yet visually glorious rampage. Amongst the first to fall was Ephraim Guardia, senior preceptor and castellan of the Citadel. His death marked the symbolic end of the Artrulian resistance, yet the violence was only a means to a greater end for Horus. The technological archives of the technocracy were now solely in Horus's possession, as was the invaluable, fully intact STC data. The War Master would go on to use this blueprint as a forbidden lure, in order to sway away factions of the Adeptus Mechanicus to his cause. Those seduced by the promise of the ancient power contained within this STC would become the Dark Mechanicus, and would go on to betray the Imperium and Mars, igniting the Mechanicum Civil War, also known as the Schism of Mars. This was not an act of conquest, but rather a calculated and well-scheduled extermination cloaked in protocol. but executed with a hasteful fury that would later be all too common in the Horus heresy. In the latter days of 004 M31, as the rift between the Imperium's vision and the War Master's hidden agenda grew, another campaign would unfold, one cloaked again as a standard compliance action, but it would be another of the many that would be remembered as a potential hint to what was to come. The world of Arigita was isolated for generations from the galactic stage, and they had developed a technologically potent civilization, proud and self-sufficient, all the while being deeply mistrustful of outside interference. When emissaries of the Emperor arrived, bearing terms of unity and the imperial truth, the response was not one of diplomacy. The envoys were executed, and their remains returned with a message, carved into their flesh: "We bow to none." Such defiance demanded an immediate response. As such, 3 legions were dispatched: the Luna Wolves, at this time the Sons of Horus, the Ultramarines, and the World Eaters. The command fell, as was increasingly common, to the War Master. The initial operations unfolded rather swiftly. The planetary defenses crumbled before the relentless advance of Astartes-led spearheads obliterated resistance. Yet one obstacle remained: the great citadel of Agrigita, a towering fortress complex where the ruling warlords had entrenched themselves behind insurmountably thick layers of void-hardened stone and arcane shielding. Their final bastion was nigh impregnable. Horus, ever focused on momentum, was unwilling to tolerate such a drawn-out siege, and so he gave Angron, Primarch of the World Eaters, specific instructions to utterly break the fortress, eliminate the leadership, and to do so with haste. And Angron, at hearing this, did not hesitate, as he was given an all-clear to use any methods and as much devastation as he needed to accomplish this goal. The assault began with the characteristic fury of the World Eaters, but Agrigita's defenders were far from cowards. The fortress's guns rained down fire and brimstone. Automated kill zones, shield arrays, and disciplined counterattacks slowed the World Eaters' advance to a crawl. For every inch they gained, a dozen legionaries were reduced to charred wrecks. What began as a glorious charge turned into a butcher's path, slow and inevitably crawling, as a slope formed from the fallen. And here we would see something utterly incredible. A literal ramp made out of the dead bodies of Astartes that led to the wall's breach. Through that narrow wound, the surviving World Eaters and Angron poured in. And there, within those final chambers, the fury of Nuceria was unleashed. What happened next was not an execution. It was not a battle. It was pure, undiluted, unbridled butchery. As the defenders, civilian administrators, officers, aides, and even cowering civilians were not spared. By the time the Ultramarines arrived, summoned to secure the site proper and establish order, they found the halls transformed into a blood-soaked, meaty labyrinth of mangled limbs, eviscerated corpses, and scattered viscera. Every corridor, every room bore the evidence of unrestrained, bestial wrath, as the walls were clawed, but not from within, but from without. The Ultramarines were utterly repulsed. Their own legion's doctrine, honed on Macragge, held fast to discipline and proportionality. This was, frankly, something else. They filed a formal writ of censure to the Emperor, documenting the indiscriminate savagery displayed by the World Eaters. But Horus, by now fully seduced by the whispers of the warp, did not reprimand Angron. Instead, he observed and calculated. In the World Eater's rising bloodlust, Horus saw not disgrace but utility. The Legion's descent into unrelenting violence would, in time, render them perfect vessels for the worship of Khorne, the chaos god of war and slaughter. And in their Primarch's berserk rage, Horus found an instrument well suited for war, not the one he had been waging, but the one he intended to wage against the Imperium. Not for compliance, but for conquest. The fortress of Agrigita had been taken, but what had truly been claimed was something far more dangerous. In the aftermath of Agrigita, as the tides of loyalty were tested and bent in secret, the Luna Wolves, now the Sons of Horus, began the irreversible descent into madness. Most within the Legion were already bound to the Primarch's will. by a loyalty born of admiration, awe, and near godlike worship, as they would follow Horus without hesitation. The War Master's transformation was not merely tolerated, it was embraced. Oaths sworn to the Emperor of mankind were almost, in their totality, cast aside in silence, replaced by dark promises and whispered in the language of the warp. The corruption was insidious, as it did not confine itself to warriors alone. Through Horus's growing influence, tainted ideologies seeped into every institution he touched and communed with. Elements within the Mechanicum, sensing the opportunity or perhaps seduced by the forbidden knowledge offered by this warp-bound cabal, aligned themselves with the War Master. Amongst them were key Forge Fanes, Titan Legios, and Cybernetica cohorts. The result was a catastrophic fracture, and from this schism was the true birth of the Dark Mechanicum, a faction that would become the architects of abominable innovation and fell machines for millennia to come. This rift truly culminated in the historical records of what would become known as the Schism of Mars, a civil war fought not just with plasma and steel, but with ideology, technology, and heresy. Yet the sons of Horus were not alone in their treachery. The War Master knew his Gene brothers intimately. They were, after all, more than just comrades. They were reflections of his own mythic origin, shaped in the Emperor's image and forged during the crucible of the Great Crusade. And Horus, ever the tactician, ever the diplomat, knew how to reach each one. Pride, resentment, isolation, bitterness of overlooked victories, or even ancient reprimands. He used all of them. Some succumbed easily, others required more tactful manipulation, favors called in, grievances intentionally inflamed, and by the end, Horus succeeded in turning half of the Primarchs against the very Imperium they were created to defend. As the betrayal did not begin on the battlefield, it began in brotherhood. But it would erupt in a great fire, one so massive it would consume half the galaxy. The War Master's next move was a decisive yet brutal blow, in a bid to purge potential dissent from his own ranks and that of his traitorous kin, and to test the resolve of those who had pledged themselves to him. He orchestrated a cleansing of the traitor legions. Loyalist elements within his own forces and those of his allies were gathered and deployed on Isstvan III under false pretenses, where they would be then subjected to a virus bombing that was designed to turn cities into ash and lungs into liquid. The survivors would undoubtedly attempt to hold on as they were hunted down in a siege of unmatched cruelty. This was a first ever act, truly severing bonds, but it would not be the last. Prior to this incident, Space Marines slaying other Space Marines was thought to be an unthinkable concept, which merited even reprimand. And soon after this incident, which we will go into greater detail, would be the slaughter at Isstvan V, the infamous Dropsite Massacre. But to truly understand how the Dropsite Massacre came to be, the Isstvan III atrocity must be investigated further. 005 M31, within the Isstvan system, at the center of a carefully staged betrayal of lies, the world of Isstvan stood, a planet that until recently had appeared to have fallen in line with the greater Imperium. In truth, its planetary governor, Varaldus Paral, had long since fallen under the sway of She Who Thirsts, Slanesh, whose profane cults had festered on the world of Isstvan III, ever since before its imperial conquest, as they had been practicing sorcery from the warp. And in doing so, Paral's open declaration of independence against Terra caused the Imperium to act. The Council's decision would prove to be a fatal misjudgment, for Horus, now already deeply in the thralls of the ruinous powers, would use these orders as the final mechanism to trigger his long-awaited betrayal and rid all remaining loyalists from within his ranks. 4 legions stood assembled under the War Master's banner: the Sons of Horus, the World Eaters, the Death Guard, and the Emperor's Children. Though each had already pledged themselves to chaos, nearly 1/3 of their numbers remained loyal to the Emperor, These were predominantly Terran-born Astartes, recruited before the reunification with their Primarchs. Skilled veterans who had directly served under the Emperor during the greatest and earliest years of the Great Crusade. And now they were a threat to Horus's vision. Under the guise of a legitimate military operation designed to quell rebels, Horus deployed the loyalist elements from all 4 legions, as they were ordered to secure the Coral City. Once the objective was taken, and under the pretense of celebrating victory, Horus enacted the final stage of his plan, having the Astartes gather within the city to prepare for celebrations. He would then, from high orbit, launch virus bombs carrying the dreaded Life Eater virus. Within moments, the toxic winds howled across the entirety of the world, as it did not kill in the traditional manner, rather it just liquefied all organic matter. The loyalist Astartes on the surface were given no warning, nor were the remaining civilians. 12 billion lives would be extinguished in an instant, as flesh became bone and bone became airborne ash, as the incendiary element of the Life Eater virus erupted. The psychic detonation of that mass shrieked straight through the warp and even briefly obscured the Emperor's Astronomicon. But something went wrong. Captain Saul Tarvitz of the Emperor's Children, aboard the Andronus, uncovered the betrayal, alongside Battle Captain Nathaniel Garrow of the Death Guard, who both would work to ensure that Garrow could commandeer the Eisenstein, as Tarvitz defied all orders from his Primarch and broke through the blockade and fire, landing planetside, where he spread the warning to any loyalists. Some made it to shelter, most did not. Angron, Primarch of the World Eaters, learned that the virus strike had failed to annihilate all loyalists. Enraged by this, he led 50 companies of traitor world eaters in a direct assault, which would range between 50 to potentially 70,000 Marines. His warriors, gripped by the rising fervor and their unknown devotion to Khorne, lost themselves in the fury of the direct assault and abandoned all strategy in favor of frenzy. Horus was greatly displeased by Angron's impetuous action. Nonetheless, he sought to capitalize on the delay, as he reinforced the assault with his own troop and the 3 remaining legions. Resistance persisted for far longer than it should have, forestalling the War Master's plans. Amongst the defenders were Tarvit, Gabriel Loken, and Tariq Targaradon, loyalist captains who had refused to surrender or bend their will to the craven gods who had now turned their legion. And over the course of 3 long, harrowing months, they stalled the War Master's timetable far more than he had anticipated possible, but they could not hold on forever. Lacking air support and denied the power of Titans, or any real reinforcement of arms, their situation grew grimmer by the day. In one fateful engagement, the traitorous captains of the Sons of Horus, Ezekiel Abaddon and Horus Aximund, were dispatched to face their former brothers. In the confrontation, Aximund was able to behead Torgaradon. Abaddon would go on to confront Loken, but their duel ended inconclusively when the building collapsed around them. Loken survived just long enough to witness the final bombardment from orbit. Elsewhere, Betrayal, Loken would survive long enough to witness the bombardments from orbit. Elsewhere, Betrayal took another form. Captain Lucius of the Emperor's Children, a famed duelist and former ally to Tarlvit, turned on the loyalist comrade turned on those loyalists around him who had believed him a comrade, in a calculated bid to gain favor with Fulgrim. Slaughtering those who had once called him brother, Lucius was welcomed back into the Emperor's Children's fold and to the caressing embrace of Slaanesh. His actions would earn him infamy as Lucius the Eternal. In the end, along with an eventual title as Lucius the Eternal. In the end, the Loyalists were reduced to a final defensive redoubt. With no remaining strategic value, Horus withdrew his forces. Then from orbit, he ordered the complete eradication of the Coral City. The ruins, the wounded, and the very memory of resistance would be reduced to dust. Aboard the crippled Eisenstein, Garrow and a handful of survivors fled their destination Terra, their mission to warn the Emperor. The Urgal Depression on Isvan V was a landscape of bleak and jagged basalt ridges, along with soot-darkened plasters. This is where the event known as the Drop Site Massacre, a turning point so devastating that it reshaped the very soul of the Imperium, would occur. Following the atrocities on Isvan III, where Horus orchestrated the complete destruction of the loyalist elements within his ranks, the Emperor responded with a force supposedly designed tailor-designed to eliminate him, as he dispatched a spearhead of retribution. A total of 7 loyalist legions were mobilized, with a singular objective: bring Horus to account. The first wave struck with precision as the Iron Hands, the Salamanders, and the Raven Guard descended upon the Ulgrel Depression under full combat deployment, launching an assault against the traitorous defensive positions upon the world. Horus's forces, however, had prepared the battlefield for this grim purpose, as the Sons of Horus anchored the defense, the remaining largely within the fortified bastions set about the entirety of the region, deliberately driving elements of the Imperial army into what would become the advancing loyalist lines, creating chaos and confusion, all the while obliterating their momentum. Within the ravines that flanked the depression, a different contest was underway. The Raven Guard, with its strike elements, were navigating the labyrinthine terrain, leading them to meet up with the Reaver and Assault companies of the Sons of Horus, units selected specifically for their aggression and surgical brutality. These forces operated independently and primarily in a defensive posture, stalking the Raven Guard throughout choke points and rock falls in brutal close-quarter engagements. Then would come the second wave. Fresh reinforcements would arrive in strength, being the Iron Warriors, the Alpha Legion, the Word Bearers, and the Night Lords, all thought to be loyalists at that point, as their drop pods thundered into the basin under the pretense of relief. But this was not the salvation the Salamanders, the Iron Hands, and the Raven Guard sought. Rather, it was a killing stroke, as they had used the pre-constructed defensive positions left by the 3 loyalist legions as strongpoints to fire upon them. Those 4 legions who had just arrived had already sworn themselves long ago to Horus Lupercal, and their arrival signaled the beginning of a massacre of unparalleled brutality. What followed was nothing short of a coordinated slaughter. The Iron Hands, the Salamanders, and the Raven Guard were now encircled and fired upon from all sides, as the reinforcements and even the defensive positions they had previously created had turned against them. Their forces, already bloodied from the initial assault, found themselves torn apart in a devastating crossfire. Tactical formations dissolved under artillery barrages, and power armored charges were utterly crushed under the weight of fire and betrayal. Then Horus himself entered the brouhaha. His presence ignited and signaled the final collapse, leading his Sons of Horus into the thick of the melee. The War Master would then shatter loyalist cohesion entirely, almost single-handedly. What had begun as an assault against traitors turned into a massacre. Command structures disintegrated, box channels howled in distress signals, then fell silent. Still, despite the overwhelming odds, remnants endured. Several thousand Astartes from each of the loyalist legions managed to extract themselves from the Cauldron's worst conflict zone. Battered, scattered, and near ruin, they would flee off-world. These survivors, though valorous, would only play limited roles in the great war to come. Their strength and, in some cases, their entire command structure had been irreparably diminished or shattered. Thus was the birth of the Shattered Legion. But the implications of this betrayal would reach far beyond Isstvan V. The rot had spread. The warrior lodges, once informal brotherhoods within the legions, had facilitated widespread indoctrination. By the time of the massacre, chaos had already sunk its claws deep into the institutions of the Imperium. The Imperial army would also fracture violently. Regiments turned upon regiments. Fleets engaged fleets. The very Titan legions of the Mechanicus, once paragons of loyalty, were likewise divided. The war had begun in secrecy, yet it now erupted across the stars. The Imperium was no longer merely fighting Horus and a handful of turncoats. It was fighting itself, and so the heresy had begun. In the wake of the Dropsite massacre, the galaxy convulsed open with rebellion. What followed was a civil war so vast, so ferociously brutal, that the Imperium still bears its scars. Known in our records only as the Horus Heresy, this galactic conflict stretched over a relatively 9 short Terran years, and it brought mankind to the edge of annihilation. This war escalated so rapidly, it became less of a campaign of strategy and more of a relentless storm of reprisal and destruction. Each blow answered in kind. Legions, once oath-bound to a common cause, turned their fury upon one another. The Imperium stars were now bathed in fire. One of the first incidents in this great war occurred in 007 through 009 M31. When Horus's treachery was fully revealed, he cast aside all pretense. The War Master would then begin his inexorable march towards Terra. initiating what would become called the Dark Compliance, a systematic conquest and subjugation of imperial sectors, compelling planetary systems to swear their allegiance or face annihilation. His legion harvested not only obedience, but resources such as war material, manufactura. Amongst his earliest target was the Machian Commonwealth, an economically crucial coalition located near the Cornid Deep. Here, the sons of Horus and the Death Guard waged a merciless campaign where entire worlds were forced into servitude. Orbital bombardment reduced cities to ash, as their conquest gave Horus a powerful industrial foothold. Strategic locations would fall like domino. The fleet bastions of Port Ma were seized, bringing in its formidable dockyards into the traitorous fold. Meanwhile, loyalist forge worlds like Lucius or Mezoa were encircled and besieged. The forge world of Cyclothay aligned with Horus and began to expand out rapidly and aggressively, carving out a dominion in its own amidst a wider war zone. Up next would be the burning of Mat, which occurred in 008 M31. The conflict itself tore even the Mechanicus apart, as the forge world of Mat, located within the Ultima Segmentum, erupted in civil war. Its ruling synod Magos fractured in loyalty. Some would stand with Terra, while others with the War Master. Reinforcements eventually arrived from both factions, Sons of Horus and contingents of surviving Iron Hands from Isstvan V, resulting in a catastrophic apocalypse. The war itself ignited a fire that would consume the planet's infrastructure along with its silos. Orbital bombardments and internal sabotage rendered the planet nigh uninhabitable, as it remains ablaze to this day. Its surface an undying memorial to uncompromising conviction and ruin. Next, in 008 M31 would occur the Dagnit incident. Elsewhere, hidden within the clade masks of Terra, acting with the authority of Malkador the Sigillite, humanity would attempt a bold strike. They dispatched an execution force, an elite cadre of assassins, to the newly subjugated world of Dagnit. Their mission was simple: eliminate the War Master before he could further consolidate his power base. Unfortunately, the difference in power between an assassin and a Primarch is a bit too much, so they failed. This attempt revealed an unsettling truth. Horus now wielded powers far beyond even the enhanced powers of an Astartes, and though the assassins perished, their sacrifice yielded a critical nugget of information. Terra now understood that it was not merely facing a traitor. They had found that he had been imbued with powers from chaos. From 008 to potentially 011 M31, the strategic planet of Paramore 5 became another fulcrum of bloodshed. Once a loyalist bastion, the world had fallen. In a determined effort to reclaim it, loyalist factions launched a campaign that met stiff and unyielding resistance. The Sons of Horus garrisoned upon the world alongside the Word Bearers, and several Dark Mechanicum-aligned Titan legions stood firm. The defense was unshakable, and Paramore 5 remained in traitors' hands, its orbital defense grid and ground batteries battering any attempt at recapture. Then would come the Battle of Asisk in 009 M31. In the aftermath of Isstvan V, the shattered loyalist element had gone to ground under the banner of the Shattered Legion. Chief amongst them was the legendary, the beloved Shadrach Medusan, a war leader commanding the remnants of the Iron Hands, the Salamanders, and the Raven Guard. But the War Master would not allow these embers to reignite into a fire that could threaten to consume his force's flanks. And so, Captain Tebalt Mar of the Sons of Horus would be sent to pursue these loyalist elements with a dogged determination. At Arisk, he engaged and annihilated almost the entirety of their fleet in a decisive engagement, causing the Shattered Legions to once more suffer catastrophic losses. And so Medusan's resistance was effectively broken. Up next would be the destruction of Dwell in 009 M31. The world of Dwell was an ancient bastion settled during the Dark Age of technology, and it became the next stage in Horus's arcane pursuit of power. Originally seeded by colonists from the night world of Molech, Dwell harbored ancient data repositories which would unknowingly lead the War Master back to the secret of the Emperor's deception. Records indicate that Horus had taken part in Dwell's original compliance, but those memories had been locked away by the Emperor himself. Now driven by vengeance and this revelation, Horus sought to reclaim what had been hidden from him. The Sons of Horus descended upon the planet. Their objective was to secure the archive and obliterate any and all resistance. In the aftermath of Isstvan V, the 16th Legion was still reeling from some of its internal cohesion being fractured. Amongst the losses, the most severe was the dissolution of the Mournival, with Gavriel Loken and Tariq Targaradon declared lost. Seeking to rebuild their tactical disarray, Captain Horus Aximund approached First Captain Ezekiel Abaddon with candidates to refill their vacant seats. Debate would quickly follow, but they would settle on Falcus Ubre of the Coltian Reaver Squad and Sergeant Grail Nocta, each handpicked for their loyalty to the War Master and their cruelty. As the atrocities on Isfahan spread throughout the subsectors, so too did resistance. A retaliatory uprising was ignited in the Momed, Instar, and Oquith sectors, led by Shadrach Medusan, an Iron Hands war leader of the Sorgol clan. Arriving too late to stand on Isfahan 5, Medusan now commanded a desperate alliance of loyalist forces, 58 battalions of Imperial Army from the Momed Voidhive, Siege Hulk from Naharan Instar, scattered salamanders, and element of the Mechanicus alongside with a handful of White Scars detachment redirected from Chondax. Dwell with its fortress cities, orbital defense network, and nearly 8 million trained soldiers became a linchpin in Medusan's defensive lines. He established command at Masulik Prinsek, a fortified complex overlooking the Sea of Enna and the city of Tween. When the Sons of Horus launched their planetary assault, they overwhelmed the mortal defenders, but not without severe complications. Medusan's loyalist Astartes, hidden within the system's defenses, had prepared. As the 16th Legion breached the outer walls, Aximund personally slew the Iron Hands Lieutenant Bion Herenko, only to fall prey to a concealed White Scars kill team, disguised as statues in the ancient plaza. Captain Hibu Khan of the White Scars led the counterattack. It was short-lived as the arrival of fresh Sons of Horus units turned the tide, routing the Loyalist assault. During the skirmish, Aximund was grievously wounded as his face was sliced off by a White Scars operative. Though his features were surgically restored by the Legion's apothecaries, the reconstructed visage bore a deep and unnatural asymmetry. It is said that the scarring altered more than his appearance, that it mirrored the mortal decay festering within his soul. One observer even noted somehow the wrongness, the imperfection made him seem more like the new Horus. Simultaneously, a shattered Legion kill cell, one of the few survivors of the massacre at Arsik, initiated a daring assassination attempt on the War Master. With his brother Primarchs Fulgrim and Mortarion at his side, Horus would survive the attempt. In response, he granted Captain Tibel Mar full autonomy to conduct a purge. As he stated, take whatever action you deem necessary to erase the shattered legions. With fragments of his memory restored, Horus turned his gaze to Moloch, the world that had once concealed a forbidden truth. Deep beneath its crust lay a direct pathway into the realm of chaos, hidden even from the Imperium's highest echelon. The Sons of Horus, alongside the Death Guard, launched an overwhelming assault as Moloch's defenses were caught unawares of the true nature of this assault, leaving them completely off guard. During the height of the conflict, the powerful Night House Divine betrayed their oath to the Imperium and defected, turning their guns against their own. In an effort to stem the tide, Malcador the Sigillite deployed a team, a veritable strike cadre of the Knights Errant, an elite loyalist order, were tasked with preparing the battlefield for a potential Space Wolves counterassault. Their mission was critical. It was to gain access to the War Master's flagship. Unfortunately, they failed. During the battle, Horus entered the portal and emerged transformed. Whatever had occurred beyond its thresholds remains an undocumented detail. What is known is that Horus returned, bearing the full favor of the ruinous powers. His strength became something otherworldly. A few of the Knights Errant, however, survived to take this truth to Terra. Those who did bore a chilling testimony. This war was no longer just for the Imperium's future. It had become a battle for the very soul of mankind. By the closing of the 31st millennium, the storm that had been unleashed on Isfahan had swollen into a full-scale galactic conflagration, and at its apex stood Horus Lubakal, War Master turned arch-traitor. His legion, the Sons of Horus, led a war host the likes of which Terra had never seen, or never may see again. The culmination of his dreadful crusade would only unfold at the cradle of mankind itself, during the Siege of Terra, the climactic crescendo of Horus's story, along with the inciting incident for the Black Legion's birth.